Thank you very much, Sinead, for that fantastic presentation. A few things that are resonating with me here. One message every 90 seconds, a domestic situation that has got out of hand, and it takes a village to replace all those broken pieces. So really kind of, powerful statements that you made there, Sinead. So I'm delighted now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Susan Lagdon, who is a senior lecturer in psychology in Ulster University. Susan is a senior lecturer in psychology in the area of mental health at Ulster University and a fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. Susan is also co-chair of the Northern Ireland Forensic Managed Care Network and North-South Co-Share Network, and is a member of the British Psychological Society. Susan's research interests include domestic and sexual violence and abuse, particularly the mental health implications of interpersonal trauma and the availability and types of supports for victims. Her work involves the use of multiple mixed methods with a particular focus on participatory and stakeholder engagement to guide her research process. The current projects include the Healthy Young Adults Relationship Project, funded under the Medical Research Council's Public Intervention Development Fund, as well as the Co-Share and Equality in Higher Education project, in partnership with the University of Galway, funded under the HEA's North-South Research Programme. Susan has been a great support to DkIT, both as an external examiner on our certificate programme that we have here in the area of DS2BD, and is also a member of our working groups and our steering committees, and we're delighted to introduce her here this afternoon.
I suppose when someone says it like that, it all sounds very impressive. So hello everyone. I really am delighted to be here today, and it has been very interesting and thought-provoking so far. Just before I begin, I am going to cover this from a research perspective, and with that, of course, there may be some inclusion of quotes from participants, from survivors, and we are talking about a very difficult topic area, so just to be kind to yourself, and I know that there's some support organisations here today should we need to avail of that. I will ask for some internal participation, so I'm not going to turn this into a lecture where I'll ask you to respond directly to me, but I do want to start, or before we begin, I hope everyone has a pen and paper, and I would like you to take a second to write down your definition of coercive control, please. So in the interest of time, I'll encourage you to, let's set this down for a second, I'll encourage you to keep writing, and I'll maybe continue forward just a little bit. So far, we have heard of the importance of understanding and responding to those who are experiencing coercive control, and some of the challenges within this, and I'm sure we can think of many. Now, I was invited here today to speak with you about the issue from a research perspective, and I will, but I want to be clear on where my perspective and insights are driven from and why I look at this issue and topic area in the way that I do. You see, I am a psychologist, I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, so naturally I'm curious and I have questions, but I'm also a daughter of a survivor. I'm a woman in this world at this time, and I'm a mother to a little girl. So my stake in the game is particularly high, it's personal, and it is something that drives me forward and often calls for both a head and heart approach in terms of how I try and address and tackle this issue. You see, it was my head and my heart that led me to want to know more about this thing, coercive control. And I say this thing because at some point in time, we didn't really have the words to describe what coercive control truly was. We didn't really have the words to describe the harmful, threatening, controlling and abusive behaviour. And I worry for the everyday person, maybe not for those of us in this room, but for the everyday person, do we have the words? So I started my PhD in 2013, and in fact I looked at the programme earlier, and I believe my external examiner Professor Stephanie Holt is in the room somewhere. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you. So at that time in my career, I was very interested in the lived experience of partner violence and abuse, particularly what exactly were victims facing, what were their help-seeking behaviours like, and what response were they getting at that time. And at that time, the term coercive control was fairly in its infancy. Yes, we talked about psychological and emotional abuse, but much like other forms of harm or violence, these were looked at as incidences rather than reflecting the pattern nature of the behaviour, the length of time exposed to different types of behaviours and abuse, and also the outcomes of the exposure for the victim and those around them. And I spoke with many women at that time and police officers who were working in Northern Ireland about their experience with responding and reporting. Perhaps it's no surprise that women felt that they had nowhere to go. They hadn't experienced the real violence yet, the one that results in a trip to A&E, so they couldn't call the police. Some officers could see the harm being caused, but they didn't have the legal tools at that time to do much about it. And to be frank, some officers just didn't recognise it as the risk that it was. Now you'll see here some commentary that I've put down from those interviews where initially one person had said domestic violence is a big thing, there's seldom a turn of duty goes past or a day where we're not dealing with it, and I don't think much has changed. One individual said, I think with regards to the police, the emotional abuse and stuff, I think, you couldn't really ring them, it's only if they hit you. Speaking about questions being asked from an officer, are you hurt anywhere? And you're thinking, yeah, in your brain. It's a horrible thing being called names and vile names. And no, the question they ask are you hurt anywhere? Do you need medical help? So since this time, as we've heard today, a few things have changed. We have a greater recognition of the term coercive control that better captures the mechanisms, forms of harm and entrapment that victims face. We also have legislation which addresses such harmful behaviour within a legal framework, allowing for statutory bodies to do more. So why then are we still facing high rates of such violence and abuse, low levels of reporting and a poor uptake of the use of the offence within legal systems comparative to the number of reported incidences and experiences? Now, to answer this question, I'd like to fast forward to some more current work and insights around coercive control. As I said before, I'm driven as a researcher by both my heart and my head. And my mum and I had a very frank conversation many, many years ago about her experiences in her first marriage. I had so many questions at that time. Why'd you put up with it? Why stay with such an abusive person? How did you not see this coming? That also turned to, why didn't anyone do anything? Why didn't anyone else see this coming? And I guess those questions of a teenager became a career. My mum explained to me that it starts with love, and that the subtle harms initially are more like compromise than constraint or contention. She didn't recognise her victim status until much, much later, until the physical abuse came. But then again, why would she? What did she know at that point about intimate relationships? In fact, I can't really recall knowing a lot at 18 or 19 years of age. What does it mean to be in a relationship, and what does a healthy or an unhealthy relationship actually look like? Now, during 2019-20, there was lots of work going on to make a criminal offence of coercive control in Northern Ireland. And this was great news. But I couldn't help but wonder if, like my mum, would the general public be able to make use of this terminology or this offence? I mean, do they know what it means, and do they know what it looks like? So my colleagues and I got to work developing a scenario-based question to be included in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey, and later Young Life and Time survey, and this approach would give us a representative sample of the population. We were working with our statutory and voluntary organisations and individuals who had had lived experience to develop those scenarios to really represent two things, which was an obvious case of coercive control and then a less obvious case of coercive control, generally representing the earlier stages or maybe in a relationship that will continue to be harmful as time moves on. We also mixed up the scenarios in terms of the victim gender representation and how we displayed that to those who were taking part in the random sample population. So we asked questions then after individuals were given the scenarios, and we asked questions about attitudes towards coercive control, the scenarios, attitudes towards the victim, attitudes towards whether an individual would talk about this, who would they report to, would they tell friends, family, would they report it to the police. We also asked if they thought the behaviours within the scenarios were a crime or should be a crime. Importantly, we asked, have you heard of the term coercive control? And do you know what this means? Now, we had a great response. So the adult survey, we had 1,292 individuals who took part. And for the Young Life and Time survey, we also sampled over 2,000 young people aged 16 years of age. So what did we find? Well, of those 1,292 adult respondents, 37% showed a lack of understanding of what coercive control meant. And this was particularly the case for those who were 18 to 24, those who were less educated, those of a lower income, which also are known risk factors. In terms of recognition of coercive control behaviours as domestic abuse, people tended to really underestimate the commonplace nature of coercive control within those relationship scenarios and found it very difficult to identify coercive control within the less obvious scenario. Otherwise, that again, potential earlier stage within a relationship. And we found a very similar trend then when we explored the concept with 16-year-olds. So the majority had not heard of the term, they couldn't identify it beyond blatant acts of harm. And actually it was fewer young women who, compared to young men who understood the concept. So, knowing and understanding, does this depend on age, experience, educational exposure, quality of that education? When and where and how are we introduced to the concept coercive control? I mean, when do we see it? And how do we know what we're looking at, given that so much of the experience is linked to the individual relationship itself, as we had talked about earlier. Now, as Buckley and Fitzgibbon note, it is without a doubt that coercive control operates in a myriad of ways in women and some men's everyday lives. Variously envisaged as a cage or as a web, a tree or a trap, its effects can be experienced cognitively, emotionally and socially. But I'm not sure again, do we think about this cognitive, emotional and social aspect at the very core of the experience and how this interacts with things like age, past experience, exposure, and of course then our education and how we deliver the message. So after that initial piece of research, two things happened. We got some funding to focus on young people and the concept of safe and healthy relationships, our HIRE project. And then we were commissioned by our Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy team in Northern Ireland to do a piece of work around violence against women more broadly. And I'm going to start with that first. So we surveyed over 500 women in Northern Ireland and we interviewed 34 more. We didn't ask women, have you experienced coercive control or sexual violence, physical violence, things like that, because of course then the issue with broad terminology is, if you ask a person, if we asked ourselves, have you had this experience? Often the answer would be no, particularly if you don't understand the terminology. So we broke it down into different types of behaviours. We asked things like, have you been threatened, humiliated, restricted from friends and family, money, healthcare, etc. 98% had experienced some form of violence or abuse in their lifetime. As shocking as that is, these findings really identify what many of us know, that these experiences are more commonplace than not. Significantly, we asked about a variety of experiences across a person's lifetime, and as you can see here, many of the women who had been exposed to non-physical forms of abuse, so we kind of aggregated those together, they were highly likely to have this experience again throughout their lifetime. So the women had talked about, before the age of 11, different incidences of psychological and emotional abuse that they were exposed to, and they were much likely to report that this happened again at age 11 to 18, again after the age of 18. Now, we did some further analysis over the last number of months to look at the likelihood or the odds that if you have this experience in childhood, what would that likely look like in your adulthood? And it should be no surprise that psychological and emotional abuse is one of the strongest predictors of all other forms of violence and abuse experienced in an adult's lifetime. So, during the interviews, women described the dangerous nature of early home exposures. Their own name-calling, shaming, public victim blaming, fears of being believed, the cost of doing nothing was also very clear during those interviews. Many of the women had said, they understood that you've been brought up in that environment, that it's acceptable, whereas they don't realise the danger that they're in. It's impossible to prove, so it's not taken as seriously as if you showed up with cuts and bruises. And that acknowledgement that Davina had talked about earlier about the serious harm of this type of torture. One individual said, every woman is going to be different, depending on how long it lasts or what it looks like. Depending on the severity of the experience, it can be life-ruining. It can make you deeply suspicious, unable to form meaningful relationships, and at best, it can make you afraid, shameful, and suspicious. These early experiences all run the risk of feeding that normalisation and habituation of violence and abuse. And as one person had said, I've had previous things happen to me in my life that had never occurred to me that was a violent act. Whether you can do anything about coercive control also depends on our social learning and the capacity to act. This is ever more difficult if those around us accept what's going on, they don't see it because of lack of education or information, or simply those who bury their head in the sand. These women were very, very clear about next steps when we asked them, what can we do? And they all said it depends on education and everyone having the same message about the harmful behaviours linked to coercive control, so there is no doubt in terms of what we are looking at and how to tackle this. It was perhaps very serendipitous that after the public awareness work that we had done around coercive control and after the Violence Against Women and Girls research, that we were also working on looking at insights with our higher project, so the Healthy Young Adult Relationships project. And we involved a number of different young people from different kind of backgrounds. We spoke to young women, asylum-seeking young people, LGBTQ young people, young men. We had a mixed gender and religious representation groups, and we spoke to them about safe and healthy relationships and their perspectives on these issues. Again, we acknowledge that many might not understand formal terminology, and based on what we had learned before, we didn't expect them to, so we got a little creative. We decided to list lots of different coercive controlling behaviours and ask them what they thought about this. And the initial insights were fundamentally, they fundamentally changed how we, the team, seen the problem. We gave a list of behaviours and discussed the scenarios, and one of these was love bombing. So one young woman said, concerningly, after we described this situation, she said, wow, that sounds lovely. So me and the other researcher looked very concerned at each other across the table, and we asked her to explain what she meant. And she had said that, a boy that I like is constantly in touch with me. He's buying me gifts. He wants to know where I am and what I'm doing. He wants to spend all his time with me. Like, that sounds great. I guess I just forgot what it was like to be a 16-year-old in your early days of those relationships and how lovely that must sound. We gave another list of behaviours that would describe things like digital tracking and the social media access issues. And again, the young people described compromise and not coercion or constraint. So I was back to when is the line crossed? And during an interview, a young woman answered that very question. This project was exploring not only concepts of partner violence and coercive control, but also perceptions, experiences and recommendations around safe and healthy relationships. And this is where the paradigm shift came. They talked about how it all really depends. The young people described how it has to start with us. You can't get into your relationship unless you understand yourself. And similarly, the behaviours, their impact for these young people depends on how it makes them feel. And this was very important for understanding experience, the effect or the linked consequences for how we also respond. I don't think we teach that part, how it makes us feel. How many times have we been in situations where your gut, your shoulder tension, trembling hands, flutters, they tell us that we're not okay with the situation and the behaviour. That's normally the first indication that something's not quite right. So let's look at our own definitions, please. And how much of that is about behaviour, or is it about how the person feels? I want you to have a look at your own definition and think, does this resonate with a 6-year-old? Does this resonate with a 16-year-old? Does it resonate with a 66-year-old? Because we know that these experiences are across our lifetime, or can be across our lifetime. Now, as I said before, I'm a daughter and a mum. I've been told many times by my own mother to take a big deep breath. Whenever the tears are coming in a difficult situation, my mum's like, you're okay, take a big deep breath. And I do the same with my daughter. And I would say to her, you need to smell the flowers and blow out the birthday candles. when we're dealing with difficult situations. I had a very unique opportunity, very brilliant opportunity last year, and I was invited to do a TEDx talk following from some of those research insights on this particular topic area. Like most things, I brought my head and my heart to the opportunity. I thought, how am I going to tell everyone about coercive control if the whole concept depends on so much? How can I tell them about the importance of starting with them, the importance of how they feel? How can I explain this to my own daughter someday, who is going to grow up in this world at this time? So I'm going to introduce you to a mnemonic that I had developed as part of that talk. And I want you again to internally participate with me today. It's a way of checking in with ourselves and our relationships at an earlier stage. So, it follows from the concept of head, shoulders, knees, and toes. We're going to start with our head. How is your mind in this relationship? Do you have feelings of self-doubt and worthlessness? Are you confused about how your partner treats you? Perhaps calling you names, putting you down, questioning your sanity and mind. In your mind, do you feel safe in this relationship? Shoulders. Do you get the sense that you're looking over your shoulder? Tense, fearing some sort of consequence? Perhaps you feel that sense that someone has their hands on your shoulder, monitoring you, whether that's in person, online, keeping track of your time, or who you spend your time with. Knees. Do you often feel you're being cut off at the knees, or perhaps your legs are being cut out from under you due to what your partner says about you or things they do to you? Perhaps you always feel that you're on your knees, asking for forgiveness but not really sure why. Perhaps you are doing this to appease your partner in the hopes that they will treat you better. Toes. Do you feel rooted to the spot? Restricted, standing alone, moving further away from friends and family, your normal activities, whether that's work, school, hobbies, interests, and as you stand in your relationship, do you feel any element of control that is keeping you right where your partner wants you to be? Okay, so we're going to take that breath now. So, I finished that talk by telling the audience that we're the best indicator of our own health and well-being, and that includes our relationship with others. And if we feel uneasy in our head, shoulders, knees and toes, it's worth a conversation with a trusted friend, a family member, or social support, or a local support service. Perhaps we feel really good in all of those areas, but now we have provoked a thought in our mind about somebody else who could benefit from hearing about the head, shoulders, knees and toes. So I encourage the audience to share with those individuals, but only if the time is right, only if it was safe to do so, because it may empower them to take action. Because as one of the individuals said during the interviews, education is never out of date, no matter how old you are. This particular concept was developed out of awareness, the head and heart approach to trying to create that awareness, and it was about trying to create some initial first steps. So I'm delighted today to share that we will be partnering with our Northern Ireland Violence Against Women and Girls strategy team, the Executive Office, to develop this further into a public awareness campaign. But its success and usefulness will also depend on feedback, interest, engagement, and of course dissemination. So if you would like to hear more, follow up on this. I'm going to ask you to use the QR code to register your interest and register interest if you want to hear more about the strategy for Northern Ireland and how sort of actions will move forward. And with that, I will now pass back to Adele to invite us for some questions. Thank you.